this there we go. Putting together this webinar series. And as she said, it's part of the partnership that Scholars for New Deal for Higher Ed. Mariah is going to put our link into the chat box for folks. But the Scholars for New Deal for Higher Ed is an independent group of scholars, educators, and teachers who are interested in rejuvenating public higher ed and really engaging in a variety of projects and activism. And this New Deal for Higher Ed with AUP and AFT has been a big part of this, and we are also carrying it forward. It will be part of the AUP Summer Plenary. So if you're interested in Scholars for a New Deal, and that we have an executive board with, I think, like 15 members right now, you can click on the link and learn more about the variety of partnerships and projects we're doing. I also just want to thank all of these amazing panelists that agreed to do this. It's been a real dream of mine to do more with promoting budget activism as a tool for labor organizing, faculty demands, lobbying. And it started, as you'll see in my brief talk, with an experience being a contingent at a community college. And my experience there with the realities of how budgeting, not just at the campus level, but at the state level, and budget formulas are encouraging adjunctification. So with that, as I introduce each panelist, and they've all done amazing, like hands-on, tangible budget work, I'm just going to simply introduce their names because we want to focus on the content and giving all the audience members as many examples and as much inspiration as possible to do some budget activism themselves. So I will be pasting more information about them in the chat. And with that, I'll just quickly go into my talk. So the overall view here is tackling austerity budgets and how do we get from analysis into action and then into building a movement, you know, using this as part of the tool. Obviously, budget activism can't do it all, but it can really be, I think, a critical part of a movement. As part of putting together this panel, I also put together what I call a rucksack. It originally started as a toolkit, but it got so large and there were so many great resources out there. And I was a big backcountry camper, and you had to carry everything in and carry everything out. So you had everything in your big rucksack or backpacks. It'll eventually have a home on Scholars for New Deal for Higher Ed website, but if you are interested in it, I'm happy to email it to you as a PDF with all the links. And these are the parts of the rucksack. There's a glossary, and obviously faculty are not all going to become accounting experts, but just enough lingo to understand what's being thrown at us when administrators and boards put out reports. Budget basic steps, getting started. And I do think the most important step that I found in doing the research was getting together a group of people that are really committed to a larger vision, that you can't just get the data, that you really need people that are going to participate in something over a long arc. And you're going to hear this as a theme from all the speakers too. And it came up in a lot of the research examples as well. Then some advanced activities, you know, once you have a committed group, once you've done a forensic audit or collected some financial reports, how do you do things like create coalitions with, say, staff, students, or alumni? How do you make it public with like-minded legislators? And so taking it step by step, that this really is something that has to start with the data and has to carry through into having some type of vision for those big steps. And then next steps is really considering what your faculty group or your faculty staff student group is capable of using as leverage in your budget demands. And that's going to be different for every campus. Some campuses like UCAFT just had a unanimous vote to strike in the fall if they don't get certain funding realignments and changes to their contract. Other faculty and staff aren't going to be able to strike. They might do slowdowns or some type of demonstrations. And then additional resources. So the rucksack really tries to offer you a variety of what you can do and what's possible, given that every campus is a little bit different. And if you are unionized, that every union has a different type of leverage on their campus or in their state. And I really wanted to talk quickly too about shifting some of this talk about austerity. I think in the past, a lot of the focus on austerity has been on cuts. And what we really need to, I think, if we're engaging in activism, is understand it's not simply cuts. It is cuts in the sense of the loss of certain types of revenues like public funding and shared funding for instruction. But it's also increases in other types of revenues like corporate and wealthy donors who often put strings on their donations. So it's really important to know where are the revenues coming from, not just what's being cut, but who's putting up the money. And then it's a redistribution of all of these revenues toward a return on investment rather than towards educational missions. So I think like if we can start saying like austerity isn't just about cuts, it's about where's the money come from, where is it going, and what is suffering the cuts. I think it can really engage more faculty and staff. Also to understand financialization is a big part of austerity, and that is, and this is occurring across the board, it's not just higher ed, this is just true in the US in general, is an increasing transfer of resources and capital into the financial sector. And it's happening in manufacturing, and it's happening in higher ed. And that is, everything is seen as a revenue center. What does it generate for revenue? The corporate model has been taken as the administrative model. Deferred compensation has become an important part of compensation for admins, just like it is for C-level executives. And deferred comp is all investments, like tax-free investment while the person is an administrator. Commercial real estate has become a huge part. I know when I was at UConn, they bought up a large chunk of property in Mansfield Center and built like student apartments on it. And then you're going to hear about investment management and debt finance from Eleni, so I won't go into that. And then a big part of austerity is with all this pushing the responsibility downward onto the smallest units, that departments and department chairs and staff and program directors are responsible for explaining revenues and costs and for making sure they cover their own expenses rather than a large institutional distribution of funds. And lastly, that language camouflage is what's basically extraction. Like universities have become a way to extract resources upward to upper level administrators, and investors and for donors to control how their money is used at the upper level. And I really got into the idea of budget and finance because I feel like the realm of budgets and finance has been basically abandoned to like legislators, administrators, and trustees. And it's overwhelming to look at some of these reports. So I understand why, especially like I'm a historian. I just happen to study capitalism and labor in the 1980s and 90s. So I think I'm a little more comfortable with some of this financialization stuff. But I can understand why somebody that does like medieval French history or, Central African ancient literature and archaeology would not really be easily captivated by this. But it's important to try to understand the neoliberal camouflage, terms like efficiency and innovation, flexibility, local control. I love that one. That just basically means like your department's responsible for your money, but there's not actually control. It's just you're responsible for the cash. Service sharing and cost sharing. What that means is they're going to stretch out staff. They're going to have admin assistants and do work for 3 departments instead of 1 department. And, we're not going to become CPAs or MBAs, but to just kind of get some of this jargon and to understand, budget research needs to look at the revenue and income side and the expenditure and outlay side. And I think and again, Every campus will be different. Some people have already started this on their campus. You'll hear from UVM and Temple. They've already started some of this research. Rutgers, I know, has. University of Arizona has. Whereas some campuses haven't even taken a look at, they don't have a group of faculty looking at their financial reports yet. If you do have the institutional capacity, Howard Buncis has done a variety of forensic audits for campuses. I think Mariah can put a couple links into the chat that you can see afterwards. If you look up Howard Buncis audit on YouTube, there's like presentations so you can see what he actually can do for your group if you have the funding and the institutional capacity to hire him. If not, you can also try to find an ally in your business department or accounting program, and they can put together some visuals and data that you can then use in a variety of ways. This is an example of something that Howard Buncis created for Rutgers. I really liked the bottom slide because it shows that tuition and fees are still providing the majority of funds. So students and faculty are the ones generating the majority of funds for the university, and yet they're the most precarious at the university. So I think that's where some of the data can really help. But as I said, data isn't enough. I discovered this when I was in the MCCC union in Massachusetts. I was part of a group of contingents that took over some leadership positions in the union. The union is a shared union of full-time tenured and adjunct contingent faculty together, but they always negotiated their contracts separately. So I went online and researched why is adjunctification happening at such an extreme level in Massachusetts? And what I found was a lot of it had to do with the funding of adjuncts. In the 1970s, when the state wanted to encourage evening and weekend classes, they told the administrators of community colleges, which were still Monday through Friday day hours at that time, any courses taught by adjuncts in nights and weekends, you will keep their tuition dollars on your campus. All the other tuition dollars had to go to Boston to go into the higher ed funding pool. So this was an incentive for them to get like how adjuncts are supposed to be used, like a lawyer or a paralegal teaching a night class or a weekend Sunday class for teachers and teaching methods. But what's happened without legislative input is adjuncts now teach 70% of courses at all times throughout Massachusetts because they provide tuition dollars to stay on campus in a time of austerity when funding from the state is being cut. So it's not just that adjuncts are cheaper, it's that they actually create on-campus revenue for these administrators. I discovered this and brought it to other contingent union folks and was like, this is a great thing we can use. I even found this report, this link here goes to a report. Oh, it didn't set it up right, but a report written in 2013 that even said what I said, like this funding needs to be changed. But there wasn't any organized effort behind it. Like everyone was still kind of just thinking about like, oh, we're just thinking about our contract negotiations on a contract by contract basis. So you're gonna hear this from Helen and Nancy too, that you really need to get people into a mindset of thinking about a long-term budget strategy, that the data alone wasn't enough, that people got very mad, but they were like, but what do we do with this? How do we restructure state funding? This is going to take a piece of legislation. This is going to take lobbying legislators. So that's why I say here, that budget activism can be a tool for organizing if you're at the beginning, just getting people started. It can be a catalyst for coalition building if you already have a group, but you want to make your group bigger and statewide or other regional campuses. Or it can be a reinforcement for a long-term movement if you're already at the stage of, okay, we have the foundation, now we need to take it further. So I'm going to turn it over to the panelists, and each panelist, this is the action that they're bringing. So budget training, faculty organizing and negotiation, institutional debt, research and reveal, and blocking massive and unnecessary non-academic construction and those types of boondoggle projects. So rather than kind of a big analysis of finance, you can get that from Howard Bunce's. This is more like how have people actually used it. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Tracy, and she will be our first speaker.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Tracy Berger. I am a communications professional at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm not a faculty member. I'm part of wall-to-wall union, United Campus Workers Colorado, and we have been doing anti-austerity work since about November in reaction. We're a very new union, so we did not exist last March when stuff started coming out about new austerity budgets, but we've been working pretty hard to make sure that we're responding to the budget changes, to furloughs, to all of the things that you all are seeing across your campuses. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got started in this work without knowing anything about university finances or budgets, and just kind of the collaboration that went into getting this work done. So I'm going to talk less about what actually were our budget impacts and what financial analysis we did, and more just about the practice of getting this work done. And okay, so this is our union, United Campus Workers Colorado, and we're part of the Communication Workers of America. We are local 7799. Our local has both several units. So we are the University of Colorado, all 4 campuses, all faculty, staff, student workers across the board. And then we have other locals that are University of Colorado Health and Denver Health. So we're public workers for the public good, and we're all trying to work together on public worker issues. And public worker issues are pretty much all issues because we're people who live in Colorado, and we're interested in housing, we're interested in social issues, we are interested in equity, all of that. So we're kind of across the board trying to do work to make this a better place. So what is a wall union? It's a little bit of a different model than I think most faculty unions have faculty. We are faculty staff, we have undergraduate workers, we have graduate workers, hourly workers, contract workers, anybody who is not, with the one exception, a classified worker in Colorado. So classified workers in Colorado, it's a right to work state. The only public workers who have the right to force collective bargaining are classified workers, which are kind of a relatively small sliver of Colorado's, or the University of Colorado's workforce. They're mostly custodial, housing, dining staff, and admin assistants, but they have their own union and they have the right to collectively bargain, which we're a little bit jealous of, which has also resulted in them actually getting a raise this year. Well, nobody else is, so we're trying to get to where they're at, and past it. So what work was involved in getting our anti-austerity project off the ground? Research, event planning, outreach, writing, editing, organizing, all of these things were super important, and they're all really different skill sets. So we had to have a lot of different people involved in this project to make it work. I was leading the research group. Another steering committee member of our union was leading the outreach group. We all kind of pitched in with event planning. We all pitched in with writing and editing the report that we ended up producing, and then organizing is still going on. We're using we ended up coming up with a petition for a fair budget at CU, and that's something that we're using to reach out to new potential members and bring them in, and also just to educate about how these budget decisions are made. For instance, the University of Colorado Board of Regents last week voted on the fiscal year 2022 budget without putting it online for any comment until literally the CFO was presenting it for a vote. So it was up for about maybe 5 minutes before they voted to approve it. So all of these things, we're just kind of trying to bring to light the practices that are going on. And that involves a lot of people. And it's impossible to do this work alone. Don't try. So this is something that I'm so proud of our group for. I'm staff, we had tenured faculty, we had non-tenured faculty, we had grad workers, we had student workers in our group, in the research group, in the outreach group, working on writing and editing and collecting information. We were all working together, and we were all able to bring different perspectives. So I'm now a communications professional, but I used to be an admin assistant. And as an admin assistant, I did department level budgeting. And I could give information about, here's how the actual process works. And then faculty members could come in and say, here's what we're talking about in faculty senate. Here are the things that we're concerned about. Let's make sure these are included. And grad workers could come in and say, we need to include more information about grad workers and fees, and just have everybody's perspective come together in one place was really important to us, and was something that I was just, at the end of the project, we kind of sat back and looked at how many people with different job classifications were involved, and we were proud of ourselves, which is always a nice feeling. And so this is trying to get into what we did to prep for our outreach. This is we're part of the National Union Communication Workers of America, and United Campus Workers is part of that. So there are United Campus Workers unions. For instance, I don't remember all of the states, but Georgia, Tennessee, Arizona, a couple other states, and we all kind of got together for these 2 trainings, and there's a 3rd training that's going to be coming up next month. So the first one was in November and December last year, going on offense against austerity. And I will tell you, I did not fully understand what austerity meant before that training. And it was a lot of information, and it was several nights of kind of getting together with these groups of other campus workers and union activists to learn about austerity, why it happened, how it happened, what it looked like, and get interested in the topic. So there was a group of people from our union who participated in that, and then we took that training forward to a couple of people who were in those trainings, came up with a list of research ideas, and then we met and talked about the research ideas and kind of divided them up. We didn't end up going after all of them, but it was kind of looking at, okay, here are all of the things that we could learn about based on everything that we learned about in this training. And then we decided which ones to go on a deep dive into first. And we are planning on doing a budget report 2 and probably a budget report 3 and so on into the future, because there really are unlimited things. And new things are going to keep coming up, like the fact that they don't put the budgets online to vote on until minutes before the vote. That may be a violation of Colorado sunshine laws. So we're looking into that as well. But we're just going to continue looking into everything and reporting on everything and making everything public and understandable, which is a really important part of this, because when you get into looking at these financial documents for this research, you'll realize the information might be public. That doesn't mean that it makes any sense or is understandable or is clear or accessible to people. So, and I'll just reiterate, like, we have no background in financial analysis. I am not a finance person. I am a communications person. I have a degree in history and education policy. I do not know how to do like advanced math, but we are learning as we go. We are learning how to do all of this, and that's what these trainings were really about. So the second training was the Higher Education Financial Analysis Boot Camp in March and April of this year, and that was really good. We collected a bunch of financial documents from our universities. This is again the different UCW chapters, getting together and looking at those documents together and picking out, okay, here are the most important things. Here's how we understand them. Here's how we analyze them. And that was incredibly helpful to just know how to read those documents, basically. And I think that that borrowed a lot on the work of Howard Bunces, because, you know, we love Howard Bunces. And then the National Union also, in addition to doing those trainings, they had a fund to help the locals with anti-austerity work that funded PR firms to help us with getting our message out, getting in contact with the media, learning how to do that ourselves so that next time we can do that ourselves. And again, we're a new union, we're learning how to do all of these things. And the National Union Communications Office also formatted our report and made it look professional instead of the Google Doc that we had it in before that. So that was super helpful. And then for co-working, we had all of the people who were involved in these trainings just bouncing ideas off of each other and trying to figure out, like, is this important? Should I go down this path? Because one of the things that we ran into in doing the research and gathering information was that there are a lot of rabbit holes that you can go down that end up not, they might be super interesting and they might end up being important, but they might take so much time that finding out whether or not they're important is not worth the time, and just focusing on the big things and then saying, okay, that's for down the line, that we'll go into researching that. So just being able to bounce those kind of ideas off of other people. And then the Communication Workers of America FEW group, which is the Public Healthcare and Education Workers group within Communication Workers of America. And we get together every couple of weeks to just talk about what work we're doing, and to talk about, for instance, like, we're working on this project about getting prison labor out of the University of Colorado, things like that, and just kind of talking about, like, oh, okay, you're working on that too, great, let's connect outside of this. And so just having those groups was really important. And so outside of our union, we had other groups and other things that we were using in similar ways. So the Debt Reveal Working Group, which I think Elena will talk more about, was incredibly helpful to me. And so reach out to everyone who does interesting stuff is really, I reached out to Eleni after reading an article that she wrote, and she brought me into the Debt Reveal Working Group, and she brought me into the other FEW, which is the Labor Notes Public Higher Education Workers Group. And just being able to say, like, hey, I read this thing that you wrote and it's interesting and it matches what we're trying to do. Can you tell me more about what you're doing, and let me know, like, anything about that would be great. So just reach out to people. Some people don't answer, some people do. It's great. And then there are lots of recorded trainings and webinars. There's, I'm gonna forget all of them, but like Bargaining for the Common Good has a couple of really good financial analysis for universities, webinars, and getting to talk, like I said before, colleagues familiar with different parts of the budget. Faculty are going to know things that staff aren't going to know. Grad workers are going to know things that staff aren't going to know. And then just like getting into the kind of academic side, reading books and articles, and then on academic side, Googling various financial terms was a big part of understanding what we were doing for this, because again, we didn't have a background in this, and just watching like Investopedia videos on what various financial terms meant was really helpful for learning what we were looking at. And I will recommend Slack. I love Slack. Our union uses Slack for everything. If you're not familiar with it, it's a messaging platform. And we have a channel that's our anti-austerity channel. And if we come across an article that's interesting, or find out that there's a Board of Regents meeting that maybe people should attend, or if there's a department budget announcement, we can share that and talk about it and try to figure out, like, is this important? Is, what should we do about it? What should we research? Putting things in there to edit, anything like, hey, I have this task that I don't have time to do. Can you research tuition versus inflation or something? Like just having that ability to share it with everybody and have anybody, people who weren't involved in the anti-austerity work could see like me asking for a specific task and jump in and start doing that task, which made it possible to have a lot more people involved. Plus, you can add your own emojis and there are a lot of options. And so regular meetings were also important to keep us on track for deadlines. So the outreach group and the research group met on off weeks. So each group met every other week. And that helped us to set deadlines and have action items and then follow up on the action items to make sure that we were getting everything done. So just having very regular meetings is important. Moderate your expectations. You won't be Howard Bunces. It's sad. But you're gonna learn a lot. If you don't know who Howard Bunces is, Amy mentioned him as well. Definitely give him a Google, watch some of his presentations. You're not gonna get to that level of knowledge about budgets and financial analysis, but you're going to become more knowledgeable and feel comfortable talking about and representing the things that you learn. And so these are the things that we did. We produced this report, Questionable Decisions, which is almost 30 pages of data about the University of Colorado's budget and the decisions that they made both in the decades leading up to now and specifically during the COVID crisis, and why those weren't the decisions that we feel like they should have made. And a lot of that came down to Colorado has some of the lowest state funding in the United States, and the university feels like they have to look towards private financing in order to make up those budget deficits, and private financing in the budgets takes priority over paying their workers and providing a quality education. And so we're just trying to break that down, looking at past year's financial statements. And then we held a town hall to talk about the report and its findings, and created a petition for fair budget priorities at CU, asking CU to change their priorities from private financing to deprioritize private financing and start prioritizing students and workers in the community. And feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions about that. This is the cutest baby in the world. His name's Eli. And then I have just a quick soapbox. Stop saying administrative bloat. Administrators are, I work in administration at a university, and I feel like my job is important and helps the university run. I hate the term administrative bloat. What you're talking about is executive bloat. What you're talking about is people who whose jobs are not necessary, whose jobs are, or who are getting paid way more than they should be getting paid. But you have administrators that you work with every day who make your job possible, who work with students to make their education possible. And I think it rubs me and other people sometimes the wrong way when people say administrative bloat. So that's my soapbox.
Thanks, Tracy. That was awesome. It was great to see the step-by-step of how you did it. And I agree. I started using the term upper administrator as a way to, because even some mid-level administrators, like you said, are very hands-on and really want to work with faculty and staff. Plus you have all the staff. So we really want to emphasize that it's upper administrator issues. So thanks for that reminder. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Helen and Nancy.
Thank you, Amy. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can share my screen properly. And go ahead, and I think that should work. So thank you, Amy. Also, thank you, Tracy, for that reminder that throughout what I'm going to present, I should be saying executives and upper administration and not just admin. But to get started, in late spring 2020, University of Vermont executives used the pandemic to declare financial crisis. They announced a 25% employment and pay cut for most lecturers and a 5% pay cut for staff who at that time were not yet unionized. They also shuttered the 80-year-old campus childcare center and in a pandemic fired its teachers and staff. And they sought at the bargaining table a 10% permanent base pay reduction for faculty, among other regressive proposals. Then, in late fall 2020, the executive class declared that the College of Arts and Sciences, or CAS, had a structural deficit of more than $8 million. They announced the termination of 3 senior lecturers with 12, 28, and 31 years of service, and plans to eliminate 3 departments: classics, geology, and religion, along with shuttering more than 24 majors, minors, and graduate programs. Now let me see if I can find my arrow. There we go. Now, UVM faculty and staff have long experience with upper administration faking budget crises to extract money, as Amy said, out of education and into executive salaries, expensive amenities, and consultants, particularly the Huron Group. For example, our first forensic audit by AAUP's Rudy Fichtenbaum in 2002 found that the upper administration had squirreled away more than $100 million while using manufactured budget crises to justify flat wages for faculty and staff throughout the 1990s. In 2008-2009, upper administration tried to use the global financial crisis to justify mass layoffs while paying themselves millions in secret bonuses, golden parachutes, and also more than $50 million to Huron. So we might think that faculty and staff would respond to the recent crises declared by UVM executives with a lot of skepticism. But many faculty actually accepted the idea that the College of Arts and Sciences is an unsustainable drain on the university and must be cut. They believe this in part, I think, because of national news headlines about the supposed declining student interest in the liberal arts, but also impacting campus consciousness has been the introduction 5 years ago of IBB, incentive-based budgeting, one of the forms of financialization that Amy talked about that, that took shape on our campus. IBB pays rhetorical lip service to transparency, but relies on arcane algorithms to recast and reify campus education and research activities as algebraic equations that determine who gets what. And the seemingly neutral algorithms obscure how upper administrative interests are rigging the game, rigging the equations. But faculty have been steeped in this logic. So a college with a budget deficit is thought to be failing to innovate and successfully compete for students. So it has been quite convincing. So one of our major tasks through UVM United Against the Cuts, which should be renamed UVM United Against Austerity, has been to expose how the IBB Hunger Games are rigged. In fact, far from CAS being a drain on the university, an analysis of IBB budget documents shows that arts and sciences every year contributes more to the university than it gets back to run its programs. In the past 5 years, for example, CAS contributed $88 million in net undergraduate tuition to the provost-controlled funding pool, but received back only $54 million. So the supposedly neutral and objective algorithms are set up structurally to underfund CAS and other UVM colleges and schools as well, so that administrators have the dollars for their priorities. In the IBB Hunger Games, the algorithms are never in our favor. So what resources were available to us as unionized faculty at a public university to investigate and expose this rigged game? First, I have to say that the latest forensic audit by Howard Bunzis was not made available to members of our union by the Executive Council. Union leadership took what I think was an excessively cautious view, also historically unprecedented view, that releasing the audit to the membership and for use in a contract campaign would violate, or a campaign, not a contract campaign, but a campaign against the cuts, would violate the no public bargaining ground rule. But what I do have here is a list of what was available to us. So to members of the faculty union, members of staff who were in the midst of what has been a wildly successful union drive, also students, community members, and alums who came together in this coalition. And I'll let you just skim over that. I do want to say something about who actually did this research. First of all, the treasurer, longtime treasurer for our union, a senior lecturer in math and statistics, has been indispensable for budget research. But also sociologists sociology faculty have been amazing financial researchers, and a music professor who points out that a lot of music is very mathematic. So he can also dig into the numbers. A French literature professor who is also a member of a city council, which involves lots of dealing with budgets and financials. And it was an English professor at another university who was digging into that university's foundation, who sent me and Helen a note and said, hey, you need to look at your university foundation. There's a lot of money being socked away there. So I just wanted to point out that there are lots of people, and this is what Tracy suggested too, who can be called upon to do this work. So my colleague, Helen, will take up in a moment what we have done over the past year to mount a campaign to try to halt and reverse these destructive cuts. But here I want to foreshadow her presentation with an argument that comes from communications scholar Dana Cloud. While we may place great faith in accumulating and crafting messages from the buckets of facts that we collect about university finances, we need more than the facts, more than the truth on our side. We need to organize, mobilize, and put power behind our truths. And with that, I will turn things over to Helen.
Thanks, Nancy. So in spring 2020, when UVM management embarked on the first round of cuts that Nancy described, the faculty union was very busy and taken up with contract negotiations. And the initial response was that the cuts were allowable under the contract, and therefore there wasn't anything we could do. But even though many accepted the dominant narrative, there was also a lot of anger on campus, particularly about the already underpaid and overworked lecturers who had effectively been given a 25% pay cut. So a few students and faculty members called an open Zoom meeting for anyone interested in organizing against these cuts. And around 75 faculty, students, staff, community members showed up. The group soon named itself UVM United Against the Cuts and agreed on a series of unifying issues and demands. UVM doesn't have a fiscal crisis, it has a values crisis, campus equity and justice, and chop from the top. The campaign argued that 1, the budget shortfall is manufactured, and 2, the path to sustainability is paved not with cuts, but with a more equitable distribution of the university's immense wealth. Instead of continuing to pour money into technical training, expensive and ineffective consultant contracts, vanity projects such as the $95 million sports arena, and outrageous executive compensation, the university should redirect funds into our primary educational mission and expand our role as a public liberal arts university. We should build on our strengths rather than trying to become something we're not. So armed with these arguments, we embarked on a series of actions. The first major event was a very noisy rally of a few hundred cars that circled the president's house and drew a lot of favorable media coverage. The campaign had very well-attended weekly meetings throughout the summer, engaged in research, finding the information that Nancy just laid out, drew up more detailed talking points, launched a Facebook page, and planned and executed a series of public events. We testified at the State House, we launched letter writing and petition drives, we held debates and press conferences, we had a mass campus die-in that made connections between the Black Lives Matter movement and fights against austerity. Makes me tired just describing it. In the fall semester, a certain amount of fatigue set in, but then came the announcements of the terminations and deeper cuts. This actually breathed new life into the campaign, leading to a return of well-attended weekly planning meetings, more press conferences, another car rally, a highly successful teach-in with 24 faculty participating and more than 1,500 people tuning in on YouTube, and a no confidence in the president petition that drew over 3,500 signatures. So a lot of people were involved. All of this had an impact. It put the administration on the defensive and it shifted the public discourse. The campaign helped the faculty union win a decent defensive contract that maintained the status quo and fended off draconian proposals that the administration had brought to the bargaining table. But beyond this, the results were mixed. The administration has rescinded some of their worst measures. They quietly restored most of the lecturers whose pay had been cut the previous year when they realized they in fact needed those lecturers to teach their full loads. Similarly, when they learned that fall student enrollments were far higher than they predicted, they offered the 3 terminated lecturers their jobs back. One had actually already accepted another position. And then recently they have boasted in the local news media, which tends to favor the administration, tends to favor management's position. They boasted that they are saving some of the programs previously slated for termination. However, while some majors, minors, and programs will be retained, a greater number are still to be eliminated, and the 3 departments are still slated for closure. Management made behind-the-scenes deals with individual chairs and faculty members, securing consent to relocations and reconfigurations under the threat of absolute terminations. In this way, they skirted the mandatory faculty senate review process for contested department closures. They continue to argue that cuts and restructuring are necessary due to structural deficits and that so-called low enrollment programs must go. It's clear that these cuts are not driven by financial problems, but they're part of the broader pattern of corporate restructuring in higher education. We won the argument, but it didn't matter. The administration, the top administration, has shown willing to weather bad publicity in order to forge ahead with its plans. So if we are to stop them, we need new strategies. The faculty union cannot afford to focus exclusively on contractual issues because most of these plans are outside the purview of the contract. We must be able to disrupt business as usual with such actions as mass walkouts. And students at UVM showed the way at the end of the spring semester with a walkout of 2,000 to protest the administration's failure to address sexual harassment. Immediately, management put in place a number of measures conceding to their demands. But faculty cannot rely on students to wage the fight against cuts on our behalf. And nor can we look to the Board of Trustees or the legislature to save us. We need to build our own collective power. We have to tackle the understandable demoralization and fear that many feel in the current climate. And we need to expand the numbers who are actively organizing with that greater vision and building solidarity both within the faculty body and with staff, students in the community. And ultimately, we have to get to a place where a large majority of faculty are willing to engage in collective job actions up to and including a strike. And I'll just end by saying that that is where our greatest power lies.
That's great. Thank you so much, Nancy and Helen. That's awesome. And I think that call to what do we do with all of this information and momentum and anger that I think is going to come out of a lot of these actions during the crisis, and turn it into walkouts, slowdowns, disrupting work as usual, and using some of those tactics that are vital to active labor movement. And I also just want to remind people to leave questions in the Q&A. I know we have a lot coming at you because we wanted to give you kind of a collage of what's possible. But if you have questions for me, for Tracy, or for Nancy and Helen, you can put them in the Q&A. And now we're going to shift to Eleni.
All right. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. And it's really an honor to get to speak alongside these fantastic activists and organizers. I think the comments that I'm going to say, some folks may have been in these kinds of conversations before, but I really want to sort of follow up on this idea of institutional debt. And I'm going to sort of make the argument that is the heartbeat of the austerity project that our students are facing, as tuition is just hemorrhaging their futures from them, as workers are experiencing furloughs, layoffs, and budget cuts. And I think one of the things that I'm really moved by the comments that Nancy and Helen's last words about what does it mean to win the argument if it doesn't matter, if the problem still persists and we know we're right. And I think that's a really important question for us all to think about. My small attempt to answer it is that there is some weight, there's some value in trying to see ever more clearly what it is that the problem, that what the forces are that are crushing on us, so that as we're mobilizing to try to fight back, we have a clearer and sharper analysis of what actually the force is. And for me, my eyes really began to open up when I began to understand the role of institutional debt in driving all of this, because exactly as Helen and Nancy just said, that there's issues that lie outside of the contract, that even the best contract that workers can secure, or the best, tuition, affordable tuition, is in some ways pre-structured by the debt and the revenue sources that our universities are relying on. So having a sense of that is important. And it's been for a bit too long, in my opinion, held off into the realm of, well, that's for the folks that do finance, that's for the technical experts. And that move is fundamentally de-democratizing of our universities. So I think reclaiming some of our intellectual and political authority over our budgets is really going to be critical for this next turn. So I'm going to share a few slides. Basically, what I would like to the point that I'm hoping to make this afternoon is this idea that institutional debt is really as I said, the heartbeat of the austerity project, that it is the sort of the institutional response, institution by institution, to decades of state and federal budget cuts for higher education. So as states dial back their commitment to funding universities, universities have to turn to often private debt financing to get the money that they need to operate. This is part of what the economic sociologist Wolfgang Streeck talks about as the transition from a tax state, where previously our public institutions were financed through tax revenue, and now they run on debt. And this is, as Amy very eloquently laid out in the beginning, is really this, when our revenue comes to us through debt, we actually should think of it as a kind of extraction, because we end up paying, like all debt, interest and fees for the privilege to borrow money that we should have had in the first place. So this takes resources from our campuses, and it is, in fact, it gets passed on to our students in the form of higher tuition, which then becomes their debt. It gets held by campus employees in the form of suppressed wages, furloughs, and job cuts. And the kind of the term that this gets talked about, what this extraction is debt service. And so that's refers to the amount of principal, interest, and fees that our universities have to pay for the privileges of borrowing money that we should have had rightly to begin with. And as I'll mention later, but debt servicing is actually not a small amount of universities' budgets. Most campuses have somewhere between 3 and 10% of any given institution's budget goes to paying back interest and fees. 3% of a university's budget may not seem a lot, but for example, I'm a teach in the School of Education at UW-Madison, and the entire School of Education at UW-Madison is well, it has 9 departments, and among other things, it prepares future educators for the state of Wisconsin. That whole college is about 4% of the university's budget, and debt servicing for UW-Madison is about 3%. So just to sort of put into proportion how much money we're paying to private banks to run our universities. So just a couple more words about what this looks like. So when we talk about debt, what that means is that there's a university that has to borrow money, and it turns to private financial institutions, banks, to borrow that money, but has to get sort of those lines of credit get bid through underwriters. And so as universities are debt financed, we can think about the fees that are going to each of these players. But what I really want to focus on for the time being is another player that comes into the picture when we have private debt financing, and that's the credit rating agencies. So because universities have to rely on debt to operate, it's in their interest to have the best credit ratings so that they can borrow money at cheap rates. So credit rating agencies, the biggest ones are Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch's, have basically one business prerogative. First of all, they're private financial institutions. They are not appointed by our elected officials. They themselves have no democratic accountability. They're institutions that are charged with one thing, which is determine whether or not an institution or a borrower is likely to default on a loan or not. And so what that means is that they end up setting what Moody's and Standard & Poor's sees as liabilities becomes universities' bottom lines. I'll say a little more about what I mean by that. So first of all, we can think about what happens with what Moody's uses. What I'm using Moody's as a fill-in here, but Standard & Poor's and Fitch's are all quite similar, is a rubric, a rating methodology to determine our credit score. And we can think of rating methodologies. Many of us on this Zoom room today are probably teachers, or certainly have been taught and are familiar with the practice of using a rubric to both incentivize our students' behaviors and then to evaluate it. So when I assign my students to write a paper and I include a rubric with that paper and I tell them that I want to see topic sentences in their essays, it's because I'm hoping to structure their behavior and then I can evaluate it. This is exactly what a credit rating report does, is it lays out the criteria that it wants an institution. It's trying to incentivize institutional behavior at the same time that it's going to evaluate how well institutions perform according to those criteria. So what exactly is on a credit rating rubric card? Well, let me tell you, it's not a pretty picture. Moody's credit ratings depend on a university's ability to do things like unilaterally raise tuition and fees. If a university has to do a really obnoxious thing, like go to a state legislature to approve rating the public university's tuition, that's going to be a real bummer for Moody's because it may impact how quickly they could repay their creditors. So that's going to ding a credit rating. The other thing that Moody's cares about is the ability of a university to secure their board of directors who are financial experts. They want to make sure that the university's resources are going to be well managed from the point of view of financial experts, which was why most of us, when we do a Google search for our university's board of directors, are never surprised that, it's rarely do we see adjuncts on the board of directors, rarely do we see students, rarely do we see the coffee shop owner who depends on the university's clientele for their business. We see corporate bankers, we see investment, folks. And this is a bit by design, because they want to make sure they see this university not as a place of instruction, of knowledge production, of community building, but as a financial institution. The other thing that they see is, this is a direct quote, the ability for a university to take decisive actions to preserve fiscal equilibrium. That's a really nice way of saying lay off workers unilaterally. In the case of a financial crisis, like for example, if a pandemic rolls through the earth, Moody's wants to make sure that there's protection in place for the university to preserve their fiscal equilibrium, to lay off workers so that creditors can be sure to get paid. And then finally, sort of the big red flag liability is the strength of unions and tenure protections on a campus. The stronger tenure protections are, the more vibrant a labor movement is, well, the more threat that's going to pose for a university's budget and resources. So I say all of this just to say that when we talk about even management's ownership over these problems, I think we need to be thinking one step beyond even what management is up to, because we can have a university management that's very sympathetic to the plight of the adjunct, to student debt concerns, to a democratic governance. But as long as the money is coming through the bulk of of a university's funding is coming through this private debt financing model, they almost have no choice but to obey the dictates of these credit rating agencies. As I said, I'm from Wisconsin. Have been working and studying at UW-Madison for a while. And, some of you all maybe had followed about a decade ago what happened in Wisconsin. We had this terrible governor. He really hated public education. He hated the university system. And as much as I'd like to say it's Scott Walker who destroyed the university, the state university system, in some ways, even Scott Walker was just following the moves that are set by the credit rating agencies to weaken tenure protections, to break unions, is to make a university more attractive for creditors. So this is all sort of a big kind of global picture of what the issue is when we talk about debt financing. Part of the issue is a financial question of how much money flows to to bankers and to private financial institutions when we get money through debt financing. But it's also a problem that I think is really the key here is a problem. It's also a power problem, because what debt financing does for our universities is it makes Moody's in almost nothing short of the shadow chancellors and governance systems of our universities. And so I think really paying attention to how revenue is coming into our universities so that we can have this. Debt is fundamentally de-democratizes what our resources are. So I think the question that we all sort of have to ask is, like, in the light of this, it feels like sort of a totalizing system. It's very hard for any one institution to sort of go on strike against the creditors. It doesn't really work like that. We have to kind of, whereas workers can win a better contract at one institution, it's going to be a lot harder for a movement for against private debt financing to happen one workplace at a time. We're going to have to really develop really thick, strong solidarity around this. And one of the things that folks have been up to, that I've been lucky enough to be working alongside of people and been active with Scholars for a New Deal, as well as folks from FEW, which Tracy mentioned, and the Debt Collective, is a project of what we call making visible austerity's invisible architecture. That debt financing we submit is the invisible architecture of the austerity problems on our campus. And part of the way that it retains its power is by keeping obscure and in the realm of the financial experts and the management elite. And so what we've been up to over the past year is a lot of organizing around trying to politicize this issue of debt and gain more vocabulary to be able to point out what the problem is so that we can demand something better. So part of what that's looked like has been working with developing a toolkit with some sort of basic resources to be able to research how much debt your university has. And we did a series of workshops around this over the fall and spring to help folks gain the fluency to look up a financial sheet on your campus. And trust me, it's really not that hard. It's really not that hard. It's as simple as, once you find the right document, which is not a difficult thing to do, doing something like Control F debt service on this document and figuring out how much debt your university has. Happy to share the little worksheet that we came up with. It's really helpful to break down some of these things so that more and more people can have authority over this, and we don't simply have to rely on one man, Howard Bunces, although he may be great, he's one guy, and we're going to need, as Helen and Nancy said, a lot more power, and we all need to see ourselves as the owners over this in some ways, because we are. And then I think the other thing is that, to keep thinking about what the horizon is that we're demanding. And I would like to submit that we have really transformative demands for the money to come to universities being publicly funded, that we're not reliant on Wall Street banks to fund our universities, that they're democratically governed, where students and faculty and staff get to have decisions over our resources instead of having private banks literally have the right to command first resources over our campuses. And that also the funding is reparative, that we take seriously universities' complicity in institutions of slavery and white supremacy and dispossession of native lands, and think about what it means to have what higher ed really can and should be doing for the crises that face us. And just one final word that I'd just like to say is that this seems like a kind of like a wild utopian horizon, but one of the last things that Donald Trump did when he was in office is that he canceled $1.6 billion of institutional debt for HBCUs. This was sort of like a silent story that slipped under the radar, but a North Carolina representative had gotten a bunch of HBCU debt, had to have the federal government be the lender for a series of HBCUs capital debt. And at the end of 2020, Donald Trump abolished this debt. And I think this is something that we should really keep in mind, that we're not talking about, this is something that really absolutely could happen and has happened under Donald Trump, that our institutional debt actually just gets written off, so that workers don't have to pay for it and students don't have to pay for it. And I think the question is exactly as Nancy and Helen put, is to build the power to make this our reality. So thanks, guys.
Thanks, Eleni. And hopefully people saw in the links, there's a great set of documents to help you look for your debt. And so that's at the debt audit toolkit. And then we'll turn it over to Steve.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here today. And there's lots I'd love to say about these wonderful and informative presentations, but I know we're on a tight clock, so I'll just plunge on in. So in January 2018, after a preliminary study totaling over $1 million, various clumsy attempts to hoodwink the North Philadelphia community, and a resulting cascade of protests, Temple University filed a project submission. Sorry, let me start my slideshow. A project submission to the City Planning Commission as the next step toward a, quote, multi-purpose facility, along with thousands of square feet of retail and a concussion study center, just happened to include a 30,000 seat on-campus football stadium in the heart of North Philadelphia that was slated to cost $130 million, a number nobody believed. Or as I called it, the Patrick O'Connor Concussion Palace, named after the chair of the Board of Trustees and Bill Cosby's former lawyer, who was the moving force behind this boondoggle. By May, however, Darrell Clark, the president of Philadelphia's City Council and the councilperson for Temple's district, finally came out in opposition to this. And Malcolm Kenyatta, who had won the primary for the 181st House Representative seat, that's Temple's district, and whom we had endorsed as a union at TAUP, had always opposed it, and as rising prominence added to the pressure. And at a board meeting in 2020, with a new chair of the board in place, a plan was quietly approved to consider placing another building at the site. So the stadium, it appears, is dead. So how is this victory gained in the midst of the ongoing obsession among university, in the face of the ongoing obsession among university trustees and higher administrators with big time sports, especially football, and their embrace of the edifice complex over core academic mission and faculty governance, and how, in the midst of Temple's decades-long disdain for the majority Black and brown community it dwells in. And what does this victory have to say about our larger question today, which is how can unions fight back against austerity in higher ed? In the brief time I have today, I want to dig into those questions as a stimulus, I hope, to further discussion, but let me offer some preliminary answers. First, smart, dedicated activism can defeat projects like this, especially when at least some of the decision makers are outside the university orbit. Two, academic unions can play a good, productive role if they enter into effective coalitions and help draw out the interlocking logics of austerity and domination. But three, these coalitions are hard to build and sustain, and unions need to learn how to listen and be ready for misunderstandings on both sides. So whenever our union has told the story of defeating the stadium, we've always been sure to give the credit where it's really due, which is not to the union, but to the residents of North Philadelphia, really, who organized the Stadium Stompers and the No Stadium, No Deal coalition that we joined somewhat late in the game, to be honest. And Temple continues to be a bad neighbor for the most part, and austerity remains its default mode. And our union, TAUP, is only just starting to figure out how to do this work. We have a lot to learn and a long way to go. Now, the plan to build an on-campus stadium at Temple did not, of course, emerge in a vacuum. It was part of a shift starting in the 1980s to turn Temple from a commuter school historically focused on first-generation college students to a residential campus. This meant marketing it to largely white students in the suburbs around Philadelphia. And during this time, it was rumored that the administration had banned referring to Temple as, quote, an urban university. And we all know what that's code for. This in turn has meant a series of master plans attempting to convert what local residents know, among other things, as the Cecil B. Moore community, named after a civil rights icon, to something very different, sometimes referred to with the awful name of Temple Town. Here you see I've turned their master plan upside down. You'll see on the right side, there's the climbing wall that of course every university absolutely needs. And you'll also see the master plan. You'll notice that the Temple part of the campus is in color, but the surrounding community is kind of grayed out, which I think is revealing. While Temple lacks the brute force of the University of Pennsylvania's obscene endowment to buy up large chunks of real estate, it has nonetheless largely frozen out its neighbors as it has expanded, and there have been a host of private developers who have snapped up properties and converted it to cheap student housing. And from the start, the stadium was pitched as part of this on-campus experience. Its attractiveness increased by the outrageous rent Temple was and is still paying to the Philadelphia Eagles to play at their stadium. Over 1/3 of that stadium, by the way, paid for by public money. And of course, there were dreams of Temple's becoming an urban version of Penn State, despite a woeful football tradition with anemic fan support and the fact that we play in the small-time American Athletic Conference. The prime administrative mover behind the stadium was President Neil Theobald. It will not surprise, I think, anybody on this webinar that he came to Temple in 2012 after serving as the executive vice president for finance at Indiana University, where he was an expert, yes, in responsibility-centered management. To go back to the University of Vermont's presentation, also known as RCM or decentralized budgeting, the austerity-friendly fiscal system that he was brought to Temple to deploy, along with the brief to get the football stadium built. While the stadium and RCM may seem to not have all that much to do with each other, they are actually two sides of the same coin of austerity. While the administration cries poverty when we were at the negotiating table, or lets irreplaceable full-time and part-time contingent faculty go because of fiscal problems generated significantly by RCM. Again, the presentation from Nancy and Helen absolutely rhymes with Temple's experience. They have no problem, the upper administration, finding funds to service the debt the bonds for the stadium would incur. Now we're speaking about debt, of course, or staff time for fundraising, justified by the profits the stadium would supposedly bring directly through revenue and parking and indirectly through alumni donations. All dubious claims, by the way, and given the effects of recently built stadiums, and you can see Akron University or Florida Atlantic University for cautionary tales, one of many, about the lack of revenue, in fact, the opposite, that new football stadiums can bring in. Now, as this was happening, our union was in a profound transformation. After multiple organizing efforts and in the face of fierce opposition from the upper administration, we in 2015 successfully petitioned our state labor board to bring adjunct faculty into TAUP. This doubled our size and meant that about 3/4 of our members were now contingent, making us even more vulnerable to the austerity thinking fostered by RCM, as separate colleges and schools were pitted against each other for a limited pool of the credit hours that now directly drove their budgets. As the upper administration's push for a stadium unfolded then, we were engaged in the fight for a first contract for our adjunct members. We were not shy about pointing out that the administration had no problems finding money from Temple's flush finances. And this has to do, don't have time to talk about it much now, but this is some of the budget analysis we did. So in this slide, this is the cumulative revenues over expenses that we got from publicly available financials. And you'll see here, one of them has to do with patient care and without patient care, because Temple also has a big medical center. Now, one caveat, we've been told by administration that a lot of that revenue over expenses comes not from Central Temple, but from the health sciences campus, but we don't actually know. And even if you cut out half or 60% of that, that is a lot of accumulated revenues over expenses, which we might in another context called profit. And we want to know where that money went. So this was the part of the fiscal background to both the stadium and our contract. So they had no problem finding money from Temple's flush finances to service the debt that would be incurred by their concussion palace, while refusing to give raises and benefits to the faculty that taught a large proportion of the classes. It was during these conflicts that I became president of TAUP in May of 2017 after serving as vice president for the prior 4 years. And our union was very fortunate, and I was particularly lucky, that at the same time, adjunct leaders who had been involved in the organizing effort really emerged into elected leadership, like Jenny Schenker, our vice president, and Wendy Marshall, chair of our adjunct constituency council. And they had deep ties to North Philadelphia and were members of the Stadium Stompers. While we had always had individual members whose research, teaching, and political commitments were grounded in the community, and while our union had always fought against the same vision that led to austerity and casualization on one hand, and Temple's mistreatment of its neighbors, Jenny, Wendy, and others called our attention to TAUP's historic inattention to our neighbors. And in this way, we were embarrassingly like the upper administration. And opposing the stadium became a way to begin addressing that failure. And our union's primary role in this fight was to rally opposition from more familiar terrain. We put together a survey on the stadium. Our members said they disapproved by 3 to 1, and we circulated results wherever we could, reaching out to our contacts in the press, both on campus and off. We agitated the faculty senate. I, for example, challenged the Rosie presentation made by our CFO. You can see some of the slides from that presentation here. And we introduced a resolution co-sponsored by the president of the Senate opposing the stadium. It passed almost unanimously. And then we sent it to the faculty as a whole for further support, which it gained overwhelmingly. I reached out to the president of Temple Student Government, Terrell Mann Barnes, who also opposed the stadium and urged him to do his own survey. And despite an administrative attempt to block it, he persevered. And the students, the people in whose name the stadium was supposedly being built, strongly opposed it by over 60%. And the chief reason they cited was the opposition of our neighbors, which was again testament to the effectiveness of the stadium stompers. But our efforts were not limited to conventional academic spaces. We began to forge relationships with community activists. The most effective part of the presentation we made to the Faculty Senate was certainly a speech from Reverend William B. Moore of 10th Memorial Baptist, who eloquently informed the Senate of how the stadium epitomized Temple's decades of neglect and aggression. I don't ever recall a member of the North Philadelphia community being invited to speak at the Senate. I began attending Stadium Stomper meetings, and by early 2018, these relationships were ripening to the point that TAUP joined the No Stadium, No Deal Coalition, and we co-sponsored a May Day protest down Broad Street, which is one of the major thoroughfares in Philly. We worked with Chris Rabb, a former adjunct activist with TAUP, who was running successfully, as it turned out, for the State House, along with other successful progressive candidates like Representative Kenyatta and Joe Hohenstein, to pressure Temple to abandon this ill-conceived plan. We wrote a letter to Philadelphia City Council urging them to add their voice to Councilman Clark's. That letter elicited the following email from Ruth Burchett, a longtime activist and Stadium Stomper, quote, "This is a great letter from TAUP. It details reasons for opposition to the stadium from inside of the university, and it echoes neighborhood sentiments, which we greatly appreciate as residents. Through all of the struggles with Temple over the years that I've been involved in, this is the first time students and faculty have supported and joined us in opposition." And when I read that email, I was really gratified for around 15 seconds. And then I realized what it meant, that it was the first time this had happened. Where had we been? It made me actually, it saddened me and even angered me in a way more than it gratified me. And I wrote back that we were glad to have joined you in this fight where you have been doing all of the heavy lifting, and we look forward to more solidarity going forward. Since then, TAUP has sought to deepen these ties. When we protested Temple's dangerous COVID plan last fall, one of our chief reasons was the threat it posed to our neighbors, and we stood together at rallies. We were unfortunately proven right as the City Department of Public Health shut down almost all in-person classes a week after Temple started spiking cases, and thus jeopardizing the progress that had been made in Philly. When the board appointed a lily white search committee for a new president, we band together with local elected officials and residents to insist they do better, and they did marginally, adding a couple more people of color to the search committee. And in the end, they did choose Temple's first African-American president, although he also has ties to the kinds of financial institutions that Eleni mentioned. And so we'll see. We want to give him a chance, of course, and see how he does, but there's some concern there. And we engaged in our contract campaigns in 2019. In our ongoing anti-austerity campaign, Temple made millions, and I believe there's a link that's maybe already been put in the chat. We felt and feel we can ask our neighbors to stand with us, and we have just created a new position, Vice President for Organizing, dedicated to both internal and external organizing. And together we're working for a Temple University that rejects austerity and values all its workers and its neighbors as it should. About to conclude. But it would be false to end this presentation on such an upbeat note. These ties are still in need of much strengthening, and we have on occasion disappointed our allies. We couldn't directly endorse the Stadium Stompers, given their call to abolish the Board of Trustees. We pulled back a bit from the No Stadium, No Deal Coalition when they attacked the building of a daycare center that would also support the research of faculty interested in early childhood development. Community members understood it as a bribe to make them swallow the stadium, and it's hard to fault them for that interpretation. But our members saw the two as unrelated, and there was the added incentive of new research space. By the way, the center has also been shelved due to community opposition. One prominent adjunct activist stepped down from the constituency council to focus more on activism in the community, and in part out of frustration that we have been moving too slow, perhaps not an inapt critique. Although we have made inroads into Temple's austerity plan, they have cut back on the cut projected for next year. Many of our members have still lost their jobs, so this is no time to pat ourselves on the back. I have faith that the new group of elected leaders at TAUP will build on the relationships we've seeded, but it will take a lot of work for us to be able to listen, really listen to our neighbors, and a willingness to act to defeat a vision of austerity that prizes fancy stadia and dorms over teaching, research, service, and the lives of those who live around the corner. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Steve. That was a great note to end on with the presentations. And I think a big reminder that people are out there to be our allies, but it's going to take a lot of work. And there were consistent questions in the Q&A about how do you get people on board, faculty and staff who feel like it's just inevitable, like Helen and Nancy talked about at UVM. There's people who are just like, they've bought the neoliberal narrative hook, line, and sinker, that this is just the way it's going. Or that the Hunger Games mentality, it's the same metaphor I use, I love it, where all these departments and faculty have been pitted against each other. And that's an intentional part of IBB. IBB intentionally fosters that that these departments are supposed to be competing with each other for funds, students, enrollment, and grants, and that they're not supposed to be collaborative. So it really does, like Steve said, it's going to take a lot of listening. When people ask me, I say, you have to develop almost like a stump speech or like a TEDx type of talk that you're just going to have to give over and over again with other faculty, staff, students, community members, and then listen and listen to their concerns too, and integrate that into whatever you're doing. But I'm a labor historian, so I'm comfortable with that idea. I know a lot of people that have never done grassroots organizing or union organizing are kind of like, wait, what? It's going to take 2 years of talking to people over and over and over again. And there's a great article I put in the chat from Donna Murch and Todd Wolfson at Rutgers AAPAFT about coalition building, and that it's work. There's no easy answer. So I did want to address that. And then there was a question about the Huron group, and that also goes there, just like, again, I'm a labor historian, so I know there's a lot of anti-union consultants out there who are hired specifically just to go in and block unions. And it's the same thing with this neoliberal austerity. There's Simpson Scarborough, and there's this Huron group, and their specialty is literally to be paid massive, hundreds of thousands of dollars to come in and promote austerity and push it through. So I don't know if Nancy or Helen want to talk a little bit more about what you did with the Huron group, or if you have any, because I don't know, like, how do you address these consultants when they really don't show up at any public events, and like the Moody's and whatever, they're behind the scenes pulling strings.
Right. I can maybe start things off, and then Helen can come in. First of all, I will say that back in 2008, 2009, when the president of our university was publicly scolded by the Board of Trustees and in the press for gross financial mismanagement, including $10 million in unapproved overpayments to the Huron group. So they weren't supposed to get more than 50 million. They were only supposed to get more than 40 million. I actually naively thought that was it. The vice president for finance, who was in cahoots, I think was actually formerly with the Huron group, left, took a golden parachute, and went to, I think, Yeshiva University and then Rutgers, and who knows where he's gone since then. But I thought Huron group was dead, and that was naive of me, because we've since found out through our union making an information request that Huron group has been alive and well and receiving millions on this campus for at least the past 5 years. I think that a coalition, like working through AAUP, scholars for a new deal for higher education, FEW, and so forth, can potentially do a lot to kind of expose these vulture university capitalists, but also on our campuses and through our unions. I think that we can't necessarily go after Huron itself, but we can absolutely, like the stadium stompers, we need to do consultant stompers. We need to, have kind of mass noisy actions about stop sending millions and millions of dollars out to branding consultants, austerity consultants, and so forth. So I really think the answer always comes back to mass action, but also vigilance. All of these secret players are out there, and I did not know about the role of Moody's until Eleni's presentation just now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say anything more about Huron per se, but I did want to just come back on the question of, how do you get people involved and people being demoralized, etc., because it's not static. I think that the biggest mistake is thinking, oh, most people aren't going to want to do this work. It's only going to be a handful of people. It's going to be a minority doing it on behalf. And I think we've got to just ditch that completely, because the whole experience of our last year has been that thousands of people have been involved, and some of the most passionate and successful organizers and representatives of this campaign were brand new people, people who hadn't been active in the union before, people who weren't activists. They were just fed up. So I think, it can become a little bit of a vicious cycle of nobody's going to do this, so only a few people are going to do it. And I think it's really important to remember that large numbers of people can and do self-organize when conditions are bad. But at the same time, you need to sustain that and just keep on doing the one-to-one patient work of building a rank and file presence in your unions, and then also building that solidarity beyond your unions. And that kind of wall-to-wall union model is fantastic. The two great things that I learned today, wall-to-wall union and edifice complex. I'm going to use both of those brilliant terms.
So we've reached the end of our time. I want to thank everyone for attending on a June summer day, and thank all the panelists for sharing their expertise. It's just amazing. And again, remind people, if you want the rucksack for tackling austerity budgets, please email me. It's got a lot of the links and some more information. And carry it forward, and we will see you again at another event. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.